Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, and I take musical theatre and film so seriously I do precisely what I'm instructed to do. So, in The Wizard of Oz, when I was told to ignore the man behind the curtain, I did, and instead concentrated on that piece of material. Isn't it lovely? I wonder where it is today. Curtains. There could be a musical with that name. Well, in this week, and indeed next week's episode of Musical Talk, we'll be looking in depth at Oh What a Lovely War, that 1963 musical which can only be described as legendary, at least in Britain. It's one of those shows which anyone who's interested in British musical theatre will have heard about. And here on Musical Talk, we've touched on it on and off since we started broadcasting in 2006. It's just one of those shows that is so monumental that it has to be addressed in some way at some time. And, as you may know, it's recently been revived at the Theatre Royal Stratford, East London, and is currently on national tour until the 30th of April. Do go along to the internet to find out where and see if you can go and see it. So in this episode, we'll be talking about that production, which I saw with Tim Sayward on its last night at the Theatre Royal East London before it went off on its tour. And it was a privilege to see that legendary show in its original venue. But next week we'll be looking at the legacy of Oh What a Lovely War, both in Britain and abroad. We'll be hearing some original anecdotes about the production, and we'll also be touching briefly upon how in 2014, only last year, the then Secretary of State for Education raised the piece as part of a national debate on the First World War. Such is its resonance. And so the word that keeps coming back, of course, is legendary. But if you like, legends are the substance which grow out from the original truth. And so today, as I say, we're going to be concentrating on that original show in review form, analysing a performance that Tim and I saw only a few weeks ago. So join us as we've just come back from Jerry Raffles Square in East London, where the Theatre Royal Stratford stands, right next to the Olympic Stadium and the Queen Elizabeth Park, to hear this review of Oh What a Lovely War. Musical Talk. Tim!
Hello.
Lovely to see you. Can I ask...
You're incorrect, I'm afraid, on that point.
Is it not correct? Is it not lovely to see you?
No, it never is.
A funny thing happened on the way here. Did you have a lovely war?
Yes, I did. It was beautiful, thank you. Yes, we went and saw it, didn't we?
We went to see Oh What a Lovely War,
To put it in other terms.
Yes, the 50th anniversary revival, which started a year or so ago, to great success when it was revived, and a lot of people saying, well, why hasn't this come to the West End?
Yeah.
But what it has done, it's come back to the Theatre Royal Stratford in London East, where it started originally in 63, and we saw it on its last night there before it's gone off on national tour, so it's currently available.
Well, it's a thing of national significance. I mean,
is.
we are currently sort of marking, I suppose, the 100th anniversary of the war, and have been
The First World War.
The First World War, exactly, and have been now for a couple of years. So, or at least two. Yeah, that's right.
Oh, that's what I count as a couple.
Okay, great.
My calculations match yours.
But I'd never seen it, I have to say, and it's done quite a lot. It certainly was when I was at school and we thought of doing production, and I saw the film directed by Richard Attenborough, which is a very starry thing that followed a few years after the Joan Littlewood production, and featured the absolute cream of the acting profession of the time, and several Redgraves were in it, and
John Mills
was in it, John Gielgud was in it, Olivier I think was in it as well, wasn't he? And basically it was sort of every theatrical night going, basically. Maggie Smith was in it, of course, did a great number that we'll talk about in a little while. But it's actually a very different beast on the stage than it is in the film. The film sort of scales it up and makes it a sort of almost Gandhi style, like, a
blockbuster.
Yeah, a thing that explores the war, but at scale. Whereas the great thing about the original musical is that it uses the songs of the time, but it feels like a theatre piece. It's very uses the conventions of the Pierrot show, the end of the Pierrot show. So it's told by lots of different clowns.
Just so people understand, the Pierrot show, long dead tradition in this country, sort of part of the wider variety firmament, sort of its heyday, I think, would have to be really sort of 1900 to about 1930 if you were pushing it.
Right, okay.
And sometimes also known as the concert party tradition.
Yes.
But as
in which the clowns all wear this. If you think of the David Bowie style Ashes to Ashes type clown with the sort of pointy hat and the sort of ruffled sleeves and stuff.
Yes, it's sort of black and white,
that
sort of frilly
tradition.
thing. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I just say, by the way, my way into Oh, What a Lovely War is the complete reverse. I've never seen the film, but I did see a very excellent version in Edinburgh a few years ago.
Right.
And so I was aware of the piece as a theatrical concept.
Right.
And a concept, I think, is the word for Oh, What a Lovely War. I think it is a proper concept musical.
Well, they credit Charles Chilton as the person who had the idea, and
BBC radio producer.
Joan Littlewood was the director.
That's right, because it famously, as I think a lot of people know, started off as a radio sort of dramatisation and documentary of the First World War, interspersed using the music of the war, almost to make a sarcastic point. Certainly it was all on the vanguard of revisionism of the First World War.
Yeah.
And so this is very much, if you like, and you said landmark at the beginning, it's very much almost the first step to that revisionist position on the First World War that most people currently have.
It popularised it, certainly,
yes.
And it was kind of quite important in popularising it.
Which is, wasn't it a big waste?
Yes, exactly.
For very little purpose.
Yeah.
Now, that's a debate that still happens. I mean, this isn't a place for a discussion on the debate, but
I don't think either of us are that well qualified either, maybe. Well, I suppose we...
No, but what I mean is only last year, in 2014, which was the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War, certainly in Europe,
yes,
the then Secretary of State for Education questioned whether the revisionist position was absolutely correct in all its attitudes.
That's right, yes.
Whatever one's position on that debate and discussion that he raised, what it shows is it's still relevant.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what were you expecting? I suppose this is my question, because we've touched on Oh, What a Lovely War here, and you said landmark, and it's one of those shows which people talk about, is still spoken about, and is a genuine example of theatre changing attitudes or helping to solidify attitudes. What did you expect to see?
Well, I think one of the key things I was probably expecting was possibly to be disappointed, because this is a very legendary production, and in fact, if you go back quite a few episodes in the sequence of Musical Talk, I interviewed Philip Headley about it, and he gave me a lot of information about additional information about how they did things like, for example, the Bells of Hell, which happens towards the end of the thing, and a couple of anecdotes about that. But I wasn't disappointed. I thought it was actually it held together very well. And while its political message is not subtle, the war wasn't particularly subtle either from that point of view. So
I think it's exactly the right approach for what it's tackling,
yeah,
and indeed attacking.
And I think it paints a very good... I mean, again, not having seen the original production, I don't know to what extent that they did, how closely observed this was to that, obviously starting with those particular clown costumes and the change of scene and so on. I don't know exactly how that was done. But they begin with this big concept of it's a war game, don't they? So effectively, it's as if it's a roll-up type of music hall attraction, and they quickly and rather deftly summarise the sort of great power politics for those who weren't sort of following that at the time, yes, or weren't around at the time. And so that's quite good. And then immediately we switch focus down and for pretty much the rest of the piece, down to the experience of like the everyday soldiers, basically, wherever they were from, whether it was from Ireland or Australia or whether it was from Scotland, England, wherever. They focus a great deal on that, and there are some very gruelling scenes where people go through, hell basically in the trenches and as part of the trench warfare. That are very moving, and I think it does that very successfully.
I think we should say here, we went with some other friends who had only the knowledge of the piece as it is popularly understood in the public conception, and didn't quite know what to make of it when they came out. Now, I can understand that, and indeed one of them said to me, I think it would have been better, he said, if there had been a kind of continuous set of characters that we could get to feel and see what happened to.
Yeah.
Now, I simply don't agree with that, because I think that's the trap that most Second World War musicals
it is a sort of a review,
into.
Yeah.
Yes.
Interestingly, they do attempt that in the film a little bit. There is an initial family who show up, and one of them signs up to go away to war, and they follow him quite a way through, actually. I think it's one of the Redgraves, actually, that does that. So so obviously Richard Attenborough felt the same.
Well, I can understand it, but I don't think this is an example where the macro being drawn from the micro, which is essentially what that concept does, helps. I actually think the bluntness. I think the show is very blunt, and I think it just shows you things and lets you gasp at it.
Yes.
Because it's unadulterated.
Besides which, your contact characters anyway are that the actors at the beginning are the actors. They're not playing a part, and they introduce themselves to you as actors, and
That's right.
And in a sense you're following them through the thing, really. So I don't think it is a weakness. There are some very famous numbers in there. We Don't Want to Lose You, I think, is a particularly famous one, and indeed, in particular, the recruitment number, I'll make a man of you, to make a man of any one of you. On Saturday I'm willing, if you'll only take the shilling, to make a man of any one of you. Which is a really strong illustration of the cynicism of the sort of recruitment effort, effectively.
Yes.
And that it pulls as they do all the way through. The sharp contrast between the sort of sentiment and the even nobility of the sentiment of the songs expressed in the music hall songs, and the horrible reality that they were pulling people towards.
Well, I think you make a good point there, perhaps quite loosely, but actually, although the show is a concept musical, if it does anything, it sort of follows the thread of the reality and also the public perception and the misperception of the public over the 4-year period of the war, 1914 to 1918. So the earlier stuff, I mean, if we just read through the song
it's
list...
very hopeful, yes. So we start with Alexander's Ragtime Band, which is a very upbeat 1904 hit, I think. And
has the lyrics...
it's Irving Berlin, isn't it?
It's Irving Berlin's song, and it's his first big hit, actually. First big international proper hit, but it's... I can't remember how the lyric works, but it's something like, it's so natural that you want to go to war.
Yes.
Actually, which sometimes is now rewritten to be slightly less stridently
martial,
militaristic.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
So that's a song that talks about, shall we say, you said the war game, they use the word the war game.
That's
that
right.
was the popular conception at the beginning for an awful lot of young men in particular, that war was a bit of a game.
Yeah.
Britain had been unusually at peace for about 10-15 years, which it often didn't do.
Well,
so there was a whole generation of people who hadn't realised what the horror of war was.
Well, these other songs, We Don't Want to Lose You, But We Think You Should Go, it's by the Ladies, is another example of that sort of music hall song that attempts to deploy guilt. Belgium Put the Kibosh on the Kaiser was a very big hit at the time, I believe, and
yes,
it was drawn from the war period.
Because basically I don't know if you know your military history, but the Schlieffen Plan, which had been revised by von Moltke, required...
I hope you're listening, listeners.
required Germany to march through the neutral countries in order to encircle Paris and France.
That's right, yeah.
But although Belgium completely capitulated, it didn't do so as quickly as the Germans had expected.
Yes.
Hence the
very... Europe took a stick and made him sore, and then as you hold your hand out, naughty boy, and he will never sit upon them anymore, something like that. I can't remember.
It was something like that, and you're quite right to remember, incidentally, the Hold Your Hand Out, Naughty Boy, which of course is actually a reference to another popular musical song called
Hold Your Hand Out, Naughty Boy. That's right.
Yes, absolutely. So it's very much in the music hall tradition.
Yeah.
But as the show develops, you move through 14 to 15, from 15 to 16, all the way through to 18, and the horror starts to swamp. So all this kind of sort of gung-ho nationalism, this kind of go on men, you're all cowards unless you go out there kind of stuff, as you say, the recruitment through guilt, that starts to... I mean, those tools are still in place, of course, because the governments of the day had nothing else to go.
No.
But the reality was it started to become swamped by the reality of the story, the stories that were coming through, and the experiences. And you see that, I think, in the songs, as they become more and more cynical, and more about loss.
Yes.
And more and more
Goodbye is how you finished, at least in the original production, that's how you finished the first half.
Okay, it's a very good song to finish off an act, isn't it? Goodbye. Please come back in 15 minutes. That's not how the second verse goes, of course.
And I Don't Want to Be a Soldier, which I think takes you to sort of one of the most bleak parts, which I think is sung to the tune of What a Friend We Have in Jesus, which was a very popular hymn of the time.
Which tells its own satirical bite.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then, of course,
When This Lousy War Is Over, which is also to the same tune, and it takes it as yet further sort of level of cynicism. And of course, The Bells of Hell go ting-a-ling-ling for you and not for me.
Yeah, a lovely song. I find the title song, Oh What a Lovely War, to be a fantastically cynical song. I don't know if you know the tune, but it goes something along the lines of Oh, what a lovely war. So it's got quite good melodic catch. Yes, and it's got lovely lines in what do we need with eggs and ham when we've got plum and apple jam? So
yes, that's right.
We've got really awful food, so don't how can we ever spend the pay? That's another one,
Yes.
Who wouldn't be a soldier, eh? It's almost a shame to take the pay, I think it is how the actual lyric goes.
Yeah.
So they're cynical, and when you sing them outside of a wartime environment, you still get the cynicism. But when you put this in the show, within the environment of trenches and death and people dying, actually that cynicism takes on a much darker hue, I think, actually.
Well, yeah.
It's not light cynicism, it's heavy cynicism.
I mean, that's the thing, and it goes, and I mean, it's that all the way through. It just doesn't really. I mean, it has that one trick is perhaps too.
A conceit.
Yeah, it's right. The concept, if you like, and it just does that over and over and over and over again until you get the message, basically. So in that sense, it's not subtle, but it's. I think they managed to, considering that is the technique all the way through, they do manage to find lots of different scenarios from the war to present to you. Some a little bit sentimental, some, very nasty. I mean, I think the one that I remember is there's a succession of, I think they're Irish soldiers that they get shot one by one, basically, and
yes.
they're portrayed as being in a trench somewhere in no man's land, sort of, and they've come under shelling. They're starting to be shelled by their own side because of the confusion of the battle. And one by one, in fact, there's a Monty Python sketch in The Meaning of Life that sort of slightly replicates the structure of it. They go off to try and find someone to get help or to, whatever for whatever purpose, and one by one we hear the shots ring out, that spell the end for each individual one of them as they go, and that's a very compelling scene, and very moving, really.
There are some real people represented in the piece overall. Some briefly, some significantly. Brief examples are the King and the Queen are very briefly represented. This is the British King and Queen. I suppose there were a lot around at the time to pick from. The British King and Queen are briefly featured near the beginning.
Yes.
And you also get Sir John French, who at the time was the principal soldier in charge of the British Armed Forces on the ground.
That's right.
Who was there, I think, until 1916. And who was famously arrogant and famously didn't bring an interpreter to meet.
That's right.
And that scene is actually portrayed where he meets other generals from other Allied armies.
From the French army, specifically.
And cannot speak with them.
And with Belgium.
And that goes as well as you would expect. And then you see a scene in the middle where you see the office politics, shall we say, of the British Army, where who's conniving with who in order to get French deposed.
Yes.
And then finally you see Haig, who history has not treated kindly, and I think with good reason. But Haig has one idea. Haig was seen as the man to replace French, although it turns out that he never actually passed his army exams.
Oh, right.
He had a position... at least this is alleged in the piece, I think, that he has a position because he has the friends in the right places. But he has one idea, which is to demoralise the German troops by continually having offences against them.
Yep.
But of course, you and I know, and it's a famous dictum, that if you do the same thing over and over again, you cannot expect a different result. And what happens is you have all the over-the-top attacks, and huge numbers die.
Yeah.
And then he just says, well, the next one will be the one that finally does it. But there's an awful lot of final pushes.
Yes.
He's a man with and he's only got the one idea, and he's shown really to be intellectually utterly bankrupt as well as morally so.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, they got themselves into a terrible situation in the sense of there was a stalemate, wasn't there, for years and years, and
yes, and
millions of people died, and the amount of land gained was pitiful, really, in most cases.
Which brings us on to one of the other concepts that you see on the stage. It's now a neon sign. It probably wasn't a sort of a dot matrix sign. It probably wasn't in 1963. But basically, at the back
I'm guessing it was slides, but
but there's a notice board essentially, an electronic notice board, and after each, shall we say, sketch, it makes it sound a lot lighter than it is, but it is a series of sketches and dramatisations. After each chapter or episode, shall we say,
you get some stats.
You get statistics, and it will say April 1916, offensive of the Somme, or whichever it is, and then it will say battle lasts 16 days, and then some truly staggering numbers: 750,000 people, 1 million people, 1.5 million people die. Amount of land gained. 20 yards, 50 yards, sometimes no yards at all. And funny enough, I thought that, when it came to pure brutality and bluntness, that was the thing, in fact, that rammed it home. The show itself was a series of incidentals and lots and lots of separate sentences from which you could combine to make a narrative of the war.
Yep.
But the full stops at the end of each sentence were 5 times bigger than they would be if you were printing them, if that makes sense. So what it did, it highlighted it. This is very... I was about to say it highlights its own punctuation, and I don't want it to sound like I'm trivialising it, but actually it was the editorial on what you've just seen.
That's right.
Was just purely statistics, so it wasn't in any way...
It's also
meant to mean anything other than what it did. It just said what it was, and that was staggering.
One thing that's interesting about this is that the show, the original show, coincided with basically the 50th anniversary of the outbreak of the war,
more or less,
give or take a month or two, and of course this now is the 100th. So we've literally, but the same show is being presented in much the same way, and we haven't seen. we've seen other shows and things about the First World War of late, War Horse being obviously the most notable, which is a very different kind of story, although I don't think its underlying narrative of how the war progressed is much different. For those who haven't seen it, which can't be many people now.
Oh, it's very much a post "Oh, What a Lovely War" show.
Yes,
in
that's
the sense
right.
of it draws.
Well,
from
it's very
the same narrative.
theatrical, and it uses, it's very sparing in its stagecraft, and it doesn't.
And it's not an apology for the war in any way.
No way at all. So, so the closest we've had probably is Downton, isn't it? And I'm not sure even
On television.
Yeah, exactly. We haven't had, and occasionally they revive. Which again is of a similar sort of flavour. Journey's End by R.C. Sheriff.
Yes.
Has been back to the West End, I think, in recent years.
Indeed, and Birdsong.
And Birdsong, called Sebastian Faulks. Yeah. So
both of which I saw in the last 5 years in the West End and on national tour.
Yeah.
Both tremendously striking. Journey's End is the nearest thing to a contemporary play. Of course, it was only written in 1920s, 26, I think. But
so in that sense, it was the first of a wave of.
It was. It absolutely was the first.
Following the poets.
Yes, because for the first 10 years, no one could talk about the war. Really, it was just so
traumatic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to ask you a question from the historic point of view. Well, here we are. We're in the 21st century. We're watching, if you like, the 100th anniversary of the war in this musical, the 50th anniversary of the show itself. When it was coming on in 1963, veterans from the war, and indeed people from that era, were all alive. Not all of them, but a large number of them were still alive.
Yes.
So it was very much in living memory. Here we are, after 100 years, it is no longer in living
There's
memory.
only
The last British
yes.
veteran is all gone.
Yes.
What we have, however, is in 1963, you could take those songs and most people would know them.
Yes.
Or most of them.
So now it's more of a museum piece.
Yes, it's a museum piece because most of those songs are now not. There is
That's
no
right.
popular currency.
In fact, the chances of you knowing those songs, unless you'd seen the show, and of course I only know most of the songs from having seen the film in the first place, that's really the only sense of familiarity you get. And of course I think that does reduce the pathos of the thing. Because if you had a grandfather, if you were 50 years ago, or even a little bit less, and had a grandfather who sang those songs, or the Pack Up the Troubles, that would have had a significance that it won't have now.
Well, that's my question. Do you think it would have packed a stronger punch in 1963 than now? Because
yes, I do, unquestionably, because I think it would have been. I think a lot of the people who were involved. I mean, don't forget also, the Second World War was much fresher in people's minds. As an adult, you could have seen it in 1963, and the chances are you'd have some memories of the Second World War, and you'd have a little bit of an idea. Particularly if you were living in Stratford, and that's where they drew their audience from, and particularly if you'd lived long enough to remember the Blitz, you'd have a very, I think, real idea about what some of these scenes are. It's quite possible for people like us who've never really had that level of discomfort to deal with. Discomfort seems a slightly trivial way of putting it, but trauma.
We've not been
and
faced with life and death in a way that anyone else.
Not at all in that way. So I think yes, it would have packed much more of a punch in those days, and I think it would have really had a very visceral reaction from people. Nowadays, it's a sort of. It's almost a little bit comforting because if you're a liberal, who sort of subscribes to what is now, as you say, the generally accepted interpretation of the war, it's not challenging in any way. It doesn't frighten you. In 1963, we'd gone off the tail end of Empire certainly, but there was still a good deal of jingoism and a good deal of the idea of poking fun at the royals and suggesting they were all just sort of a political class out for themselves and stuff like that was I think even then a little bit more radical than it is now.
Oh, now that's interesting because I didn't read this as an anti-royalist piece.
No. Well, sorry, no. I neither did I. But it's certainly heavily emphasises the distinction between the people like the Haigs and the Frenches and the people at the top of the tree,
the privileged classes, should we say?
And their lack of engagement with the suffering of the working class people who were going to the war. I mean,
I now can't remember if this joke was in the piece or not. But do you know the joke about the soldier who's on the in the trench in the First World War and decides to desert? So he runs away from the trenches and he runs day and night for 4 days and 4 nights, and he eventually comes to rest in this village. And a man walks up to him in British officer uniform, and the man says, "What are you doing here?" And he says, "I'm deserting, sir." And he says, "Don't you know who I am? I'm a general of the British Army." And he says, "Blimey, have I run that far?" I can't remember if that joke was included or not.
No, I think it might have been actually, yes.
But it very much sums up the who was safe and who wasn't idea.
Well, I think also you'll notice that there are very few attempts to portray the people in the middle, actually, because there would have been a lot of people in the middle. There were people right at the front line in appalling circumstances. Literally, there's one scene, isn't there, in which a nurse describes not being able, people who are literally dying in front of her eyes, who cannot get treatment because they, despite the fact that they're dying in front of her eyes, are not as high a priority as some other poor bugger, basically. And there's literally no beds, and people are on crates and on, it's horrifying. And then the contrast is obviously very clearly drawn between the ballroom, in which the office politics that you described happens for the senior ranks of the army, and we don't see much of the people in between. We don't see the sort of bureaucrats and the middle classes and the shopkeepers and the home front and stuff like that. We see little of that, which in a way sort of helps to
polarise.
Yes, to keep the picture very stark and to sort of keep the contrast very stark. Having said that, of course, the people on the front line, we are talking of millions and millions of people, so it's not as if there's a shortage of stories to tell.
And an awful lot of, it has to be said, an awful lot of upper class sons were officers in the trenches who died as well. So it's not as simple as that, is it? Can we go back to the score, though? Now, you said quite, and I agree with you. I think for people who knew the songs will have a greater resonance, particularly as the songs were being used in a way that they may or may not have been intended, or at least were understood to have been intended in popular culture in the 60s.
Yep.
However, now, for all intents and purposes, these songs are not known. So it is, in fact, actually a new score. Although it isn't, of course, it's actually a jukebox musical in one level.
Yes,
because
it is,
they're all plucked.
And was at the time,
Yes. It is, because the songs are no longer known. Now, you said you think it would have had a stronger impact. Did you think the fact that you didn't know the songs for the most part robbed it of any impact for you? Or was the piece still impactful?
No, I think it's...
And did the music aid that, I suppose?
Well, the thing is, I did know the songs from having seen the film, but I don't know really what to say. But other than, I'm sure it would have had greater impact. If there were songs that we know from our childhoods that mean something when they appear in a TV drama, and that's inevitably always going to be the case.
But that's not quite what I was asking. I was the fact that you don't have huge knowledge, or one might. Were the songs necessary, or could it have worked without the songs?
No, it couldn't have worked without the songs because
what did they bring, even to a modern audience?
Well, because they are the principal means of ironising the whole thing. So I mean, I think it's like in Cabaret, or like in a lot of those sort of hard-bitten musicals where the songs are as a convention are used to sort of throw into relief, like Dancer in the Dark and things like that. Where the songs are used in such a way. I'm trying to think of other examples. Chicago, there's lots of ironic songs, and that's sort of what Kander and Ebb do, as we'll probably talk about another time.
But those are newly written songs.
Yes, but in a sense...
the irony is still there.
But given that they, in Kander and Ebb, for example, the songs are frequently based on specific tunes of the time that the music is set
styles,
on, in fact, does give you the same feel.
It subverts a well-known model, and that's what's going on here, I think.
It's also probably worth saying that, of course, some of the songs that we're getting are themselves satires on other songs.
Yes.
So Hush, Here Comes a Whiz Bang is based on a song called Hush, Here Comes a Dream Man, for example, which was so a lot of what we get in the second act, particularly, are ones, and the Sergeant Seals Your Rum, and they were only playing Leapfrog. That's actually is that the Battle Hymn of the Republic? I think. I think it is. So those ones are, already you call it folk music, or they're subversions of existing songs.
Well, I think once again this shows that move from the British public to the British soldiers. So in the first act, as I said, we move from the public trying to get the soldiers out there, and all those songs were written for the music hall. They aren't soldier songs; they're songs about soldiers.
Yes.
Or to encourage people to become soldiers. As it moves on, the songs become more and more from the trenches themselves.
Yes, that's
right. And they're going to be a much bitterer.
Except, interestingly, at the very end, when they switch to the Ivor Novello, "Keep the Home Fires Burning." Which was a song written at the time, I think.
It's actually right from the beginning. It's actually from 1914.
Which, of course, isn't ironised, and in fact seems to, is a...
It's a song of poignancy.
Which tends to disguise the sort of horror of war, doesn't it, a little bit?
It's sentimental, and that's Novello all over.
I think it's placed there for the older generation who would have seen the show originally.
And, well, I can tell you, even to this day, you have to have a select audience, but I was in a show in Edinburgh in summer of 2014, and Keep the Home Fires Burning was sung beautifully And the older people in the audience sang along with it. That is a
Right,
song that
okay.
still has, for a certain generation, certainly not the generation of the war.
Well, it's a sort of we'll meet.
power.
It's the sort of we'll meet again of the First World War, isn't it?
It is, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I tell you the other thing, and I've discussed this in previous episodes of Musical Talk as well, unlike all the other sort of anthemic songs of the First World War, and that is what it is not a national anthemic song.
No.
It's actually about the individual and the personal, and not about the state
That's
and the
right.
battle. It is about separation and loss, and not really about fighting.
No, that's right.
Which is why I think it's actually survived. You know, it survived the transition of '63, which is, if you like, the teetering point when
Yes.
the pre-revisionist and revisionist occurred.
You see that transition also in things like John Osborne's The Entertainer, which date from a similar period, where
Yeah.
where the music hall culture, and of course it is the one of the characters is an old music hall star, you know, represents basically the end of empire and the end of that perspective.
Yeah.
That was, you know, that people internalised if they were from the First World War generation in order to try and get them through the bloody thing.
And that was Laurence Olivier again in the film.
It was
version.
indeed, yeah,
Yes. The thing I was going to make, the point I was going to make actually about the score also is it's actually quite cleverly paced. It's used, I think, to help the audience acclimatise to the horror of it all. Certainly in Act 2, we see more and more of the neon signs as the years progress. The numbers become staggering. I mean, as we speak about it, it's almost impossible to get the power across, but when you're seeing people on the stage and then it says 1.5 million people died, that's
Was it
the highest
Verdun,
number.
I think, or Somme? I can't remember, something like that. Yeah,
There were several.
Yeah.
You know,
I think it was Verdun.
it was shocking, and that was the stuff that sort of pulled that gave you the punch in the stomach.
Yeah.
But actually, what they then did, of course, is they used the songs to just occasionally, throw you a straw to cling on to.
Yeah.
So there'd be there's actually a sing-along in the second act, which is Sister Susie sewing shirts for sailors, or socks as I know it, but it's shirts here, and it was on the night. There's also a couple of others which are a little lighter or a little pacier, and what you do, you've just seen something truly gruesome or truly awful. You've been shocked to the core, and then they give you a little bit of a respite by giving you a song that just feels a bit bouncier or funnier, or maybe not that funny, just not shockingly awful.
Yeah.
And you grasp at it, and then sometimes they would pull the rug away from you under the.
I was going to say there's a lot of rug pulling
Yeah.
really going on. I think, you know, you sort of enjoy yourself for a few minutes and then.
Yeah, they throw you a life raft and then discover it's got a hole in it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. No, it's a very, as I say, it still does that successfully today.
So, Sister Susie sewing shirts for sailors was a sing-along.
Soldiers?
For soldiers, you're quite right. I'm so sorry if I got the armed forces wrong. I think airmen could be ruled out, as they famously go shirtless, apparently.
Yes.
Here's the point. Actually, it's the only song that you were asked to do that music hall tradition of singing along with.
Yes,
now,
that's true.
partly, is that to remind you that this is still pretending to be a concert party? Because by this stage you're so immersed in the horror of the war that actually you sometimes need to be reminded that there's a framework.
Yes, I think
Partly
I think
that.
it's also to just lift the audience a little bit towards the end. I think
Yeah.
it sort of has a structural function really, which
So
is
people don't commit
which is-
suicide in the car park.
Well, maybe, yeah, just just to sort of bring people up, and it's sort of in the position in what would be a sort of conventional Broadway musical of the what they call the 11 o'clock number.
Well, I actually think it's rather closer to a pantomime in that sense. In fact,
Yes.
it's the number towards
Oh,
where
that's
you've
true,
pretty
yeah.
much wrapped everything up very nearly. You're waiting for the walk down, but
That's true.
you get the front of curtain stuff where they actually sing.
Well, we don't know where that originated. Maybe it did originate in other forms, you know, because I mean.
Well, Victorian pantomime adopted a lot of things from other places, so yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. But can I ask, what they do is, the conceit, however, is they get us, the audience, to sing along once it's been sung along with on stage once or twice.
Yeah.
But then it gets faster and faster and faster and
That's
faster.
right.
What is the symbolism of that? Is it just that towards the end of the war, everything was just being done over and over and over and over again until something
I
broke,
suppose
which
there's
is essentially what
yes,
actually
the
did
sort
happen.
of the machine, as it were, sort of, you know, the war machine had gone mad, sort of thing. You know,
Yeah.
is the feeling? Yeah, I suppose, and that that everybody couldn't keep up and became victims of the thing. I don't know really. I mean, it sort of feels like it belongs in there. It doesn't.
Oh.
It doesn't feel like a jarring sort of sudden attempt to just jolly everyone along. You know, I mean, it absolutely feels like it belongs to the show. And I think one of the things is that there's a great deal in there about the meaningfulness and meaninglessness of the recruitment narrative. So that, you know, just these words that get mouthed about sort of one more push and pulling through and, you know, all of that sort of stuff. You know, one for I don't know what they used to say in those days, but you know, putting a face on it and you know, those sorts
stiff
of
upper lip, yeah, that's right.
schoolboy expressions of the era. You know, those through meaningless repetition eventually come to seem empty and stupid, and I think that's kind of what it does.
And yet, forgive me, I just want to contrast that against. There is a scene, I think it's in the second act, where we see sort of a liberal woman giving a speech from a balcony, arguing that the war is futile and that people were being sent to their deaths. Right. And in fact, it has the reversed effect on the civilian population who are being portrayed listening to it. They see it as sort of anti-national.
Well, that's right, yes. They think she's attacking the sort of, she's basically saying that we should lose the war sort of thing, And
so they turn against
her.
Well,
I think that's there for a very good reason. I think the reason is that, people watching the show who don't know why the war happened might very well be thinking to themselves, well, why didn't they do what they did in Russia and revolt against the government and get rid of them? And it sort of shows you just in a little miniature there, like what the problem was with people trying to sort of get some traction for showing people that they were being oppressed.
Also,
it was very, very politically illustrative, actually, isn't it? Because you see it all the time. You see it today. That's something we see today as much as people don't want to be told that they're being exploited. They want to be told that they have a chance.
Yeah, it's a way of playing people, isn't it? I thought it was quite interesting because in the earlier act, the first act, as is known, there is this scene actually where, as you say, they're trying to recruit and I'll make a man out of you. White feathers are passed to people in the audience, which actually occurred in the First World War. Yes. This is something I only knew recently. It's not actually featured in the musical that we saw. But this, I think, it underlies the point you've just made about how why people didn't back it up. Historically, suffragettes are seen very much on the liberal side as being progressive. Yep. Absolutely, of course, votes for women. I think that's fairly self-evident. That's not a battle anyone needs to discuss today. But they were seen as radical at the time. And despite their radicalism, I hadn't realised this, but the suffragette movement was one of the principal movements, one of the principal movers behind the white feather movement, which makes it, forgive me from my modern perspective, you expect the good people to be good and the bad people to be bad, but they're not, because everyone's a bit good and everyone's a bit bad. And and that is only something I realised recently, and I was shocked by that.
I tell you where a lot of the resonance of this show comes from now, actually, for those who don't have those personal memories, i.e. nearly all of us. Is of course we're currently undergoing this business of austerity.
Yes.
And and I think you sort of hit upon it by saying that people reject that sort of narrative. So it sort of does have quite a strong parallel here in the sense that we're being told, well, one more push, a little bit more saving, a little bit more
one more term to finish the job,
belt tightening, and a little bit more, desperate saving, and we'll cut a little bit of this, and we'll cut a little bit of that, and somehow we'll get through this, and we'll pay down our debts. It is very much the exact rhetoric of the First World War, the establishment in the First World War, and I think it, the show encourages you to look at it in the same way. And there are people arguing against it, saying it doesn't have to be this way, and why do we have to sort of, throw, in this case, masses of millions of billions of pounds into it, as opposed to billions of lives, But a lot of people on the ground say, no, actually, this is don't you dare talk the country down, and we should just be taking benefits away, or disability benefits, or reducing immigration, or whatever it is, So I think maybe
the debate is still being had on the same terms.
So I think maybe in that sense, it's sort of lucky that the 50th anniversary of the show has come around at this time, because there is a sort of a parallel. And of course, if you imagine what Joan Littlewood would be doing now, if she was running,
it would be exactly about
the Theatre Royal Stratford East. It would be, things like can't pay, won't pay, or whatever, that illustrate that would take up arms, as it were, against that thing. In fact, the parallels that we have now between the Europe of immediately before the First World War and the Europe that we face now are many dissimilarities.
But they're perhaps closer than they've been for a long time.
But when you look at Russia, when you look at the sort of macro situation, when you perhaps even look at Greece a little bit. It's difficult not to be reminded in some ways of what's going on.
There's more European and wider European antagonism than we've had for a very long time.
We just have to hope that some modern day Archduke of the German Empire doesn't wander too far down into Greece and find themselves getting assassinated by a lone gunman on a street corner.
I thought you were going to say something completely different there. I thought you were going to say somebody who has an innovative idea for a musical might come along and show us all the error of our ways, but, which I thought might be a happier answer.
Well, I'm pretty sure that somebody is working on it now, and probably there's such things already been put on, but yeah.
I'd like to draw out some of perhaps the subtler symbolism as well, which might have got lost. And I'm going to start by actually talking about the earlier production I saw in Edinburgh a good few years ago, but which was excellent. They started off as Pierrots with white painted faces. So Pierrots wear this black and white costume, as we said, sort of clowns, as you say. But they were wearing white makeup. And what was interesting was, as the thing progressed, more and more of them smeared their makeup. So by the very end, everyone except the fella playing Haig had smeared broken makeup to
yeah.
signify death, and
Yeah.
in this,
Well, the face had come off it, really. I mean,
Yes.
that's sort of what they're saying.
in this, I was very struck by the staging. It was quite a spare stage. It was a black box essentially, but there was a bit of what they'd done. Yeah, they'd used sort of wrought iron to extend the stage layers, i.e. the stalls, the boxes and the gallery, shall we say. I think it was principally just stalls and boxes, onto the stage. So it looked like the Royal Box had another box next to it, which was actually on either side of the stage.
Yeah.
And that was used very effectively for people to climb up and down. And obviously when you do see the Queen and the King, they are in the box briefly. And also it serves as a pulpit, actually, for Haig's almost religious devotion to his, and indeed praying to God for his plan to work. So it was quite effectively used. But what I really liked was that the set was wrought iron, and as the show progressed, and I don't know if you spotted this, the wrought iron was sort of broken. It was obviously pre-broken and made, but it looked cohesive and intact at the beginning of Act 1. As it went through Act 2, it was broken into bits, and suddenly you think, well, hang on a minute, theatre is actually a microcosm of, even to this day, a microcosm of the British class structure. You have, the higher, the lower, the cheap.
Those down below, yes.
Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely. You've got boxes to keep the, separate the royal box. The boxes are very separate. You've got the stalls. Exactly as you say. It's a solidified representation of the British class, perhaps upside down because the cheaper people are at the top.
Yes,
but essentially you've got that. On stage, we saw that structure being broken down. Figuratively, because we saw the boxes being broken up to a degree. And I thought, well, the one thing we all know about the First World War is it broke up the social structure of the country, introduced a new one, and you could say that class is still as absolutely rife, and that's true, of course it is. However, you get the rise of the middle class and the at least the eclipse for a century of the upper class.
Alan Bennett puts it in 40 Years On, the mulberry-faced gentlemen sort of come to the fore, the ones lined up behind Baldwin and Chamberlain.
Yes.
And, the sort of the professional class, as it were. It did well. I mean, the First World War is thought again in the conventional narrative to have had like a huge. It's basically spelled the beginning of the end of the empire.
Yes, it did
very clearly, because of course it massively financially impacted the country apart from anything else.
Well, Britain's greatest year of production was 1913, which tells its own story.
And certainly it spelt pretty much the end of the aristocracy as it had been up to that point.
Yes, Britain is for sale, as they said in the 1920s, when all the landed estates had to, well, a lot of them had to sell up, and thank God for the National Trust.
Well, exactly, yeah. So I think it sort of did presage a de-stratification of the country. And again, there's the relevance for today's audiences. It's suddenly starting to appear again.
Which is why I use the word eclipse rather than proper diminution. Yeah. However, let us briefly go back to Oh, What a Lovely War. Let's just pick up a couple of things which I think are lovely. We went to see it at the Theatre Royal Stratford. They had run out of programmes for the current production, but what they were doing was selling a facsimile version of the 1963.
Yes, which is brilliant.
And the cast list is very telling. There's a few names on it who are still known today. I'm going to mention the late Victor Spinetti, who was very famous, and you may not have heard of him, but he was a close friend of the Beatles in the 1960s, and he was performing on television.
Was he not in
on stage.
Help, in fact, I think?
Absolutely. Well, he was part of their wider sort of comedy group, if you like. But the name, and George Sewell, who, amongst other things, he was in Remembrance of the Daleks, I think.
Oh, yes, that's right.
However, the name that leaps off the page most surprisingly to me is Brian Murphy, who, for a certain generation, will remember as George from George and Mildred.
That's right, yes. And, of course, he was in The Sing Detective as well. Another name that leaps off for me, actually, is Murray Melvin, who is not particularly well remembered, I think, in general, but he went on to... I can't remember if this was... I think he would have already have done this, actually, before that. I think A Taste of Honey preceded... Oh, What a Lovely War. Of course, again, I'll refer you back to the Philip Headley interview for a lot more detail about that if you want to go all the way back up to the top of the feed. But he also played the main male character in A Taste of Honey, which of course was a Stratford East.
He was the taster of the honey.
He was a very early portrayal of a gay character, a sympathetic portrayal of a gay character on the stage, and that in itself was a bit of a...
In the 60s, quite striking, yeah.
I'm interested to know from this programme, because it is a great museum piece, and it's great to have it, just about the different style of language. Many different wines, beers and spirits can be had from Mrs. Parham in the Long Bar, or from Ed in the Circle Bar. Coffee, chocolates and snacks can be obtained from Mary in the snack bar, and you can buy in Theatre Royal Stratford East, whereas today you would buy jerk chicken, or they have a Caribbean restaurant there, enough oysters and champagne for two of 15 shillings. And it also says here, this is all their sort of indicia, in accordance with modern theatre practice, national anthems will only be played in the presence of royalty or heads of state. And I don't know if every theatre had that policy, because it was quite common in the 60s and certainly in the 50s for pretty much any entertainment to end with the
cinema
full
certainly
national anthem.
did.
Yeah.
Although, interestingly, of course, not that she's a head of state, but Princess Margaret famously came to see Oh, What a Lovely War in its original run and told the Lord Chamberlain that he ought to license it.
Oh, right, okay.
Because actually, it's the irony being that it took a personal intervention from a close member of the royal family to make sure that it was able to continue.
Right, okay.
Because we are still in the era of the Lord Chamberlain's office.
Yes, we are, just. It was still getting towards the end, wasn't it? It's like 68, I think they finished,
yes.
Or 67, yeah. And the other thing they have in here is a thing called the Somme Times, a reproduction of a quote advert from the Somme Times, which was basically written and printed in the front lines, it says here. So basically soldiers are sort of satirising. Are you a victim to optimism? You don't know? Then ask yourself the following questions. 1. Do you suffer from cheerfulness? 2. Do you wake up in the morning feeling like all is going well for the Allies? 3. Do you sometimes think the war will end within the next 12 months? 4. Do you believe good news in preference to bad? 5. Do you consider our leaders are competent to conduct the war to a successful issue? If your answer is yes to any one of these questions, then you are in the clutches of that dread disease. We can cure you. 2 days spent at our establishment will effectively eradicate all traces of it from your system. Do not hesitate. Apply for terms at once to Messrs. Walthorpe, Foxley, Nelms and Co. Telephone 72 Grumblestones and telegrams to Grouse. I like that a lot.
And as you say, that's an extract from something from 1916, I think, isn't it?
Yes,
from,
that's
from
right.
the war itself.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a lovely little sort of thing that was available there, and although I would have liked to have had a more contemporary programme, I must say this is a wonderful thing to have.
Yeah.
So, Tim, having seen Oh, What a Lovely War on stage for the first time, I think lovely isn't the right word for the production, but, you know, if I was asking you, how did you feel when you left, is that what you think you were intended to feel? And
yes, I think so. I mean, yes, one was generally intended to be left with the feeling that it was not a terribly good thing.
On the whole,
on the whole, it wasn't lovely at all, as the rather misleading title had led me to believe as I went into the theatre.
But there is one thing I think actually that leaps to mind that we probably need to discuss actually, and that's being manipulated. I mean, we subscribe, I think, on the whole, as most people do, to the theory that's being promoted in this.
Yeah.
And you said it was a very unsubtle message, and I used the word blunt.
Yeah.
Was it manipulative?
It was persuasive. I think it's a proselytising piece of theatre, and it's intended to, as with so much of Joan Littlewood's work and Brecht before her, I think, perhaps most significantly, it was intended to reach a conclusion, and it did. The argument continues to rage among historians about how accurate or how valid that point of view is, but it's kind of hard to argue with some of the statistics about how many people died and whether that was a good idea that they died or not. It's kind of trivial to argue, isn't it? And so we also do know, and I think we've known it from many wars since, that people do financially benefit from war.
Oh yes. And
that was illustrated too, wasn't it, in a little scene about arms manufacturers and how much they were making from the whole caboodle. So,
Tintin illustrates that, funnily enough. Hergé uses an example from real life in the 1930s of someone representing one of the armament companies who was selling in anticipation of the Second World War, I think, to both sides. Because there is no morality in business.
No, well, exactly. So I think it makes its point extremely forcefully, and I think very successfully. And certainly by the time that I studied the First World War, and as a child at school, and in which that was the first time I came to see the film.
Yes.
I think the narrative in Oh, What a Lovely War, as emotive and strong as it is, probably had a good deal more in shaping my opinion of it than any amount of stuff that I read in any of the textbooks I then went on to study.
Well, thank you, Tim, for talking about Oh, What a Lovely War, which we found to be a lovely experience and yet quite a striking one. And to be recommended, it is on national tour.
It's on tour. I reckon everybody should see it.
So do I, as it happens. And the one thing I would say about the excellent production I saw in Edinburgh a few years ago, it was done by a school, and I spoke to a very enlightened man who was their director, and he said he likes to do it for every school generation, so that they all get a chance to do it.
Yeah.
That's right. Thank you, Tim. I look forward to seeing you on a future edition of Musical Talk, which they say will be all over by Christmas, but I don't believe it. Musical talk. Well, Tim Saywood there, discussing the actual performance of Oh What a Lovely War and its resonance today. And in next time's episode, we'll be looking at different parts of its legacy and legend. We'll be discussing how it was a massive success in Britain in the 1960s, but wasn't in America, and the possible reasons for that. We'll be looking at whether or not it was right to be described as being a negative part of British culture in the 1960s, as it recently was last year by the then Secretary of State Michael Gove, MP. And we'll be hearing a short reminiscence from Philip Headley, the co-executor of the estate of Joan Littlewood, about the original production and its transfer to the Royal National Theatre. So, a bumper bundle of goodies for you there, with Oh What a Lovely War, the legacy, in next week's edition of Musical Talk. And so until then, it's time for me to say goodbye. And here's me saying it. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk presented by Thos Ribbits and Tim Saywood and edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2015. And why not go along to our Facebook and Twitter accounts and see what's happening, or you can follow me at Musical Talk Thos on Twitter. My question was going to be... Oh God, I've bloody forgotten it again.
You see that transition?
Go on. No, I will remember.
You sure?
Oh yeah, no, it's back again.